I wanted to thank you first off for joining me. It means a lot to me. I found you through looking into consciousness and mindfulness over the last several months, and mostly through Dr. Harris's app and y'all's really intriguing, fascinating discussions on mind and brain and the interrelationship between those. And of course, this came as my inquiry into the hard problem, which turns out to be a very hard problem. And if you don't mind, I know you have a myriad of excellent titles that are intriguing. Would you mind recapping those briefly, just if you don't mind?
Sure. Excuse me. I am an associate professor of research at the University of Southern California, USC, and I work at a brain research institute that's called the Brain and Creativity Institute, where we study all aspects of brain function. I'm also the co-director of the Dornsife Neuroimaging Institute. That's one of the main neuroimaging institutes on campus, where we study brain function using functional neuroimaging. I am the associate director for functional brain imaging at the USC Mindfulness Science Research Center. Geez, I always get the name of that center wrong. Something like that.
Well, you got a lot of titles.
Yeah, titles are a dime a dozen these days. But what I do is I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I study how the brain works. I've always been interested in consciousness and in how the brain constructs our conscious experience and our experience of ourselves, and where the self and the identity comes from in relation to brain activity, and a whole host of questions that surround those topics and are peripheral to them.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you. And knowing that you're associate director of mindfulness, I came across a lot of these inquiries kind of insightfully through mindfulness, and found that I guess some of these inquiries can start to present themselves to you as you engage in mindfulness practice. Inquiries you may never have thought were too intriguing to look into, because you're almost questioning premises that are so basic that you feel as if you can't really go down that far, because you need to start top down. And so you start looking bottom up. And it brought me to your discussions with Dr. Harris, and consciousness is something I try to center this discussions around. But with your work, it's all the inquiries come kind of from consciousness, as far as belief change and narrative structure of thought. And so I kind of wanted to ask you, this is kind of panpsychic type idea, but you talk a lot with split brain research and the intriguing look into islands of consciousness, as you and Dr. Harris kind of called it. And that is an interesting idea, because it kind of cuts at the heart of, is consciousness divisible within the human brain? Is it required to have a brain to be conscious? And I find that a pretty intriguing premise to look at, because a lot of times it seems to me the holistic element of the human brain has to be intact to have consciousness. But when you could split the brain and have almost two identities exist within one body, that kind of allows us to kind of drive further down to that question. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that split brain research, whenever you divide the brain in half, and how that presents to us the ideology that potentially we have multiple islands of consciousness within an organism, and what your thoughts on that kind of are.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the excuse me. This is one of the first topics that intrigued me in neuroscience. And when I was a graduate student back in the 90s, I worked with a man named Eran Zeidel at UCLA, who had been studying the split brain. And the split brain is intriguing for just the reasons you said, the fact that we can split the brain and there seem to be two different consciousnesses in one head. The important thing to point out there is it matters how you split the brain. You can't just split the brain in half in any which way. It's a particular kind of cut where you can maintain a consciousness, because you're doing it in a way that maintains the vertical integration of each independent cerebral hemisphere. So in the split brain operation, you typically cut the corpus callosum, which are the fibers that connect the right and left hemisphere, and possibly some of the other commissures that connect the brain. The two sides, there's more than one. And some of the patients that we tested, they had all of them cut, so they were completely severed. Still connected at the brainstem, of course. But you have all of the perceptual mechanisms of each hemisphere. It has its own visual cortex, has its own auditory cortex, has its own somatosensory cortex. So it can touch and feel, and also all of the, given the redundancy of the left and right hemispheres, it's like you pretty much have every function included if you split it that way. And it is notable that you can't just split it the other way. If I make a horizontal cut through the brain and I separate the bottom part from the top part, then I have different sets of function in each island of hemispheres, and you're not going to get a full intact two minds in one head. So I think the reason why we do have two minds in one head is just because of the organization of the brain, that there is this redundancy on the left and right. And one of the questions there is that, given we have this redundancy, to what extent is our own consciousness, even when it's not surgically split, a collection of loosely integrated processes? And to what extent is the integration of our consciousness real versus some kind of illusion that the brain presents to us? And I tend to think that it's really more the latter, that we're not aware to the extent to which we are a set of loosely integrated processes that can be integrated or disintegrated at various times. And the brain works hard to sort of present a unified self to us that is something of a papering over of reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the idea of the self and it's its own enigma, kind of, but it opens the door not to just consciousness with the split brain research, like you just mentioned. It helps us kind of get an ideology on, is the self an illusion as far as the ego, and is there multiple different selves that present themselves in different environments, cultures potentially? And what to kind of go on what you just said, it's interesting to see the redundancy in the left and right. And I was intrigued by you mentioning how the manner in which it is separated, because I was always under the impression, if the corpus callosum, you cut that's the only separation pathway. That's the only way I conceptualize that idea prior to you mentioning that. And so it's kind of fascinating to know that there's different ways in which the brain can be separated, not just the corpus callosum. And it's important to know it's not a lateral cut, it's a vertical separation between the two redundant, almost brain-like mechanisms. And you had mentioned the brainstem is still going to be there. And so the limbic system, I think that's where you're looking at the primitive portions of the brain, as they say. And so you still have those intact, but when you split the two brains, you see two different personalities emerge. And I think actually Dr. Harris's wife, who has a great book, Conscious, I just mentioning that because I had followed that up after y'all's discussion. She had mentioned kind of somebody who was like a fundamentalist Christian on one side and an atheist on the other. And they would almost argue with themselves and their own body about what their beliefs were. What's your thoughts on that? Is that the level of consciousness that we see arise in the two hemispheres, or is it a little different than that?
I haven't read Annika's book yet, although I'd really like to. I'd probably have to follow up with her on that particular case, because to me that sounds more extreme than what we typically see in a split brain patient.
I think that was an extreme example she used too. I think she mentioned it was an outlier. I just really enjoyed her book, so I was kind of that was an idea she had put as an example.
No, I mean, it's interesting, even if it's true, just as an existence proof of how different things can be. Typically we would see some kind of an initial conflict between the two hemispheres after the surgery. So you could get things like, one hand buttoning up a shirt while the other one unbuttons it. But those stories were rare in the life of the split brain person who tended to live with this condition for decades, and mostly presented themselves to the outside world as an integrated individual who had a consistent kind of behavioral integration across the two hemispheres. And it was only with really careful, precise testing that you could kind of suss out these subtle differences between what the left and right hemispheres could do and how they thought of themselves. So I would say, in most cases, the differences probably aren't as extreme as that, but that's the case if it's true.
Yeah, I think that might have been more anecdotal. I think it was kind of just an intriguing way of looking at it, because you think of the left and right generally as these, the right being creative, the left being logical, kind of factual, analytical, and the combination of those two together allows us to take narrative, take logic, put them two together. But now it seems there might be a more evolving structure and model of the brain that's arising from some neuroimaging. And that seems to be, it may not be so divided, particularly into the parietal, the temporal, occipital, but there could be a myriad of connections and communications that occur in the brain that kind of place that model to the back burner, and the front burner may be now an idea of the brain being more interconnected, more in neurogenesis work that seems to be coming out with mindfulness and psychedelic work. It seems to prove, or at least kind of indicate from what I've read, that there's a potential new model of the brain emerging that may be a little less, more dynamic and less static in the way we look at the brain. Is that have you done much? I would like to know your kind of thoughts on that in your work that surrounds that kind of idea.
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. There's definitely a lot of focus now in neuroscience on understanding how the connections between different brain regions and the interdynamics of the interplay between different brain regions forms our cognitive processes. And In a lot of ways, this is, if you look at the history of neuroscience over hundreds of years, it's kind of a pendulum that swung back and forth from thinking of the brain as highly specialized and modular on the one hand, where each particular brain region is specialized for one specific task. And if the pendulum swings way back to the other side, we have a point of view where no part of the brain is really specialized or does anything on its own. Everything works in cooperation. And we have this kind of just, you damage one part of the brain, you're going to lose function in general, and there's no specialization of function at all. This is a pendulum that has gone back and forth many times, in the 90s and 2000s, when neuroimaging was really coming to prominence, and we were able to see the specific functions of particular brain regions. And also the field of neuropsychology was getting better at tying particular lesions of the brain to specific behaviors, because we could image the brain and see exactly which part of the brain someone lost in a stroke, for example. It really gave rise to this almost phrenological view where there was a high degree of modularity, and each specific brain region is specialized for a specific function. And now that pendulum has started to swing back the other way to look at the interactions between these brain regions and large networks of interconnected regions that are specific for different kinds of modes of thought. And so there's definitely a lot of work in neuroscience focused on that right now. I tend to think that, seeing this from the 1,000-year view, that the pendulum's still going to swing back and forth a few more times before it settles somewhere. So I think network neuroscience has produced a lot of important insights, but I also am not someone who has completely thrown away the idea of modularity. And there seemed to be some specialization of function in the brain with a relative specialization of function. Some parts of the brain do seem more specialized than others. So, for example, sensory cortex, parts of the brain that process sensory information, like the early visual cortex is fairly specific for processing visual information. It doesn't mean that it can't be influenced by auditory information. For example, when you hear sounds, they invoke certain visual images. And so if you do brain decoding experiments, you can often tell what someone's listening to by looking at their visual cortex, because those connections are there. But that doesn't mean that the visual cortex isn't specialized for processing vision. So I think there's sort of a mix of specialization of function and long-range interactions in the brain that give rise to our minds. And it's just so incredibly complicated to figure out.
It is such a complicated to figure out. And the analogy of the pendulum works well, though, because like you said, it's almost like no matter how far you go in the particular lobe model, if you're concrete in that, you're always going to have to be pulled back a little bit in the other direction. And then you study that. It's the pendulum seems, like you said, in 1,000 years, hopefully it settles somewhere, but it seems to be 50-50, 60-40, but that percentage may never be known all the way. But it's intriguing to know that there's not dynamism in that idea, because it allows consciousness research, I think, to advance maybe some, because the very strict type physicalism that is within philosophy, where it's a particular region to a particular emotion, it at least kind of allows me to maybe think that physicalism, we could evolve past that viewpoint, because neurogenesis in itself and the idea of a dynamic model of the brain doesn't really give too much credence to this particular one-for-one emotion brain region idea. And like you said, the specialized regions like the Wernicke's area or the Broca's area or the visual cortex, when you lesion those, you lose those abilities, so those are physically related, but then you can't find that. It becomes almost like a token physicalism, where that does have merit to me, that idea where one thing can in a different way produce the same emotional state or something along those lines. And so I think looking at physicalism, we can at least evolve past this very rigid type one-to-one, region-to-region brain versus emotional state arising. And I find that pretty neat to look at, because then you can kind of move into panpsychism without feeling like you're going too pseudoscientific on it.
I think you're going to have, I that's interesting. I'm aware that panpsychism is gaining more popularity now. And I watched one of your early videos where you said that you were a panpsychist. I'm hoping you can try to convince me of that, because I'm skeptical of panpsychism myself. And I think I would have to hear the arguments.
To tell you the truth, I do subscribe to it in a certain kind of way, but like my beliefs right now on it are kind of so dynamic. I'm changing them constantly, because I'm trying to, as I looked into your talks on belief change and things like that, I'm trying to be really open to rapidly changing my beliefs on consciousness quickly, so that I don't get stuck in chasing a rabbit down an infinite hole or something like that. But
No, that's fair. I'm open to it as well. I feel like I haven't looked into it recently. And the fact that so many people that I respect are convinced by it means there's probably something to it. But to me, the function of the brain has always been so important for understanding exactly what it does. And it seems like you have to have specific functions happen in order to be conscious. If you change the way, like you said, if you damage Wernicke's area, you're going to change the sort of linguistic aspects of our consciousness. But the brain, arranged as it is, has to do certain things in order to give us consciousness. So like if it's like it doesn't when we're dead or under anesthesia, even though it's physically excuse me,
no problem.
Physically more or less the same, it's not doing the same things. So to me, there's such an important contribution of function to consciousness that I suppose I'm something of a functionalist.
Yeah, okay. No, that makes sense. And I think as I've looked into it and thinking in panpsychic terms, it's hard to define consciousness, as you know, and as I've found out. I seem to think now that, in my opinion, consciousness has to almost involve some sort of interaction from the organism itself and its environment in almost an anti-entropic way, to where it's self-organizing with an instruction manual like DNA. It's like once you have that instruction manual of DNA to separate the organelles from the outside and then start exchanging gases and nutrients and self-organizing in such a way that your goal is to increase your survivability and also your complexity. It's so fascinating to me that entropy is such a trend, is obvious as a law of thermodynamics, but with life, you see this self-organization all the way to the human cerebral network, which is overtly advanced. It seems to me that it's almost like DNA is telling an organism that separates itself from its environment that this is how you operate in a way to become more complex throughout self-organization. And to me, trying to take consciousness out of the human brain as being an emergent property, I find it very difficult to follow the idea of emergent consciousness, being that emergence in science usually doesn't fit into that definition of consciousness. Emergent, non-physical matter emerging from physical matter never really happens. Like an emergence, when you look at a snowflake, it's a little easier to comprehend emergent snowflakes from snow, but it's really hard for me to think of emergence as applying scientifically as a term to consciousness. And it's also hard for me to think of consciousness strictly as an illusion. I know the brain kind of, Anil Seth is an author I really enjoy, and he can, and you talk a lot on and I find it very intriguing, the idea of the prediction machine of the brain. That's complex, but that seems to be, if you probe that question more and more, what's your thoughts on this, that if you probe that more and start looking at the easy problem, not easy, but as people call it, easy problem, Anil Seth kind of thinks that as he does structure, like you were just mentioning, finding out levels of consciousness so you can be more compassionate in your administration of anesthesia to brain dead patients and things like that, you can know for a fact, are they conscious and what level of consciousness do they have? He thinks that, okay, the brain's a prediction machine. And as we look into these easy problems, the hard problem will kind of go away because we'll know so much more correlates and neural correlates that will kind of understand the actual computer network of the brain, so much so that the hard problem will go away or answer itself.
Right. Well, I have a lot to respond to in there.
Sorry.
No, that's great. With the will the hard problem go away when you solve the easy problems? That's an open question. I mean, that's something that Daniel Dennett argued early on when Chalmers first proposed the hard problem, that, really, it seems like a hard problem in the way that, you can't really comprehend how a magician does his tricks until you see the solution. And then it seems like, oh, okay, that's how it's done. So I do think that, it doesn't make sense for us to prejudge what the answers to these questions are and whether they're solvable or not until we've gotten to the end of all the easy problems and we still have this thing left over that we can't explain. If we solve if we completely understand how all the processing of the brain works and what the relationships between all of our cognitive processes are and all the specific biochemical and electrical things that happen in the brain, and we still haven't explained consciousness, we've got all of this seemingly complete information, there's something left over, then at that point, yeah, we can throw our hands up and say, well, I guess the answer wasn't in there. But I just feel like it's really impossible to prejudge before you know what the solutions are to those problems.
That makes sense.
Related to the other thing you said about how consciousness could emerge and the relationship of consciousness to the job that life does in fighting against entropy, I think that's a really interesting point. And it reminds me a lot of Antonio Damasio's work, and he's someone that I'm particularly influenced by because we work together. He founded the Brain and Creativity Institute at USC, where I work, and he's really impressed upon me how important it is to think about the origins of consciousness in biological systems and in evolutionary history in order to understand it well. And I think what you said is really important there, that life fights against entropy. And in his view, consciousness is rooted in some of the biological systems that are there to maintain homeostasis, to keep our organism within a certain set of parameters that it needs to be within in order to live. But just doing that alone doesn't seem to be enough for consciousness, at least if you're willing to grant that things like bacteria don't seem conscious. They are fighting against entropy. They have borders to themselves, and they're doing things. But to me, they don't have consciousness in the way that I mean it. At least consciousness in the way that really seems like consciousness to me doesn't arise until you have organisms that have nervous systems where you have explicit representations of the internal states of the body, and you have neurons that are basically re-representing homeostatic processes to give us maps of what's happening in the body. And that happens in nervous systems, and it's something special that happens in nervous systems. This is sort of why I'm a functionalist. It seems like you have to have a certain arrangement of biological functions on top of just the fact of life itself, which is this fight against entropy. So having borders, having homeostasis, to me isn't enough for consciousness. But as soon as you have a sort of self-mapping of what all that stuff is and what's going on, then you're getting closer.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. No, good point. I like the fact that you talk about homeostasis there, because it is interesting, because like you have warm and cold-blooded animals, and one of them has the ability to maintain homeostasis, internal body temperature, but the other more primitive idea, they can't even perform homeostasis all the way because they have to be dependent on their external environment. Otherwise, they don't have the ability to really keep we can keep our body at 98.6 when we're in 40-degree weather. That's a really advanced, complex version of homeostasis that almost seems evolutionarily more complex. And then you have less ability to maintain homeostasis with automaticity at a lower level of lower levels of neural system arrangement. And so I think there's a lot to be said, most certainly, about homeostasis and the way that the body can maintain internal states of basically being warm or hot, but then lower level animals can't do that because they don't have the neural system that's advanced enough to send the right hormones, to release the right enzymes and things to generate internal heat. So potentially that's pretty interesting. And also I wanted to say this idea of the anti-entropy, and it's kind of representative of Dr. James Cook. He's a person I had interviewed, and he has a living mirror theory of consciousness. And I wanted to credit that with being partial to what I had just said. He has a paper published in the Journal on Consciousness Studies, and he's a very intriguing, intelligent researcher on this subject. And he has some more elaborative information on this. And so I was just mentioning him because he's a great thinker on this, and he has some of those philosophical interpretations. And another thing I wanted to mention to you, when you were saying having the neural system or a complex, or maybe not complex, but having some brain essentially to invite consciousness, or some arrangement of neurons where there's an interaction there. I read something recently that was referencing like a paramecium bacteria existing, and they were saying how it can actually arrange itself to learn, remember, and operate. It actually has the capabilities demonstrated even at that bacterium level to show learning and memory occurring somehow. And so what it was doing was almost using the cytoskeleton and the microtubules that keep the membrane out. It was utilizing those and the flagellum that it uses to move almost as a brain, it said, because it was like feeling its surroundings. And it was kind of intriguing to me that how somebody was postulating on the fact that maybe, I keep going back to these microtubules in my thoughts, but because Roger Penrose is a thinker on microtubules being the origin of memory and potentially of cognition at the pyramidal neuron level. And so I was thinking, to your point, paramecium being able to show learning and memory, and he was using the microtubule arrangement of their cytoskeleton to kind of say, this is like a primitive brain because it can feel its environment and then remember where obstacles were using the flagellum. And it's very maybe complex, but I just understand it elementary, like maybe the fact that memory and learning were shown in that lower level, and it was interacting with its environment in a self-organizing way, that it kind of maybe gives a little credit to the potential that there could be a lower level of consciousness existing at the cell level, but maybe not.
But there's a difference between an implicit representation and an explicit representation, and to me that's the key. So paramecia, bacteria, they do all kinds of amazing behaviors. I mean,
Yeah.
bacteria do things that look like they have social lives
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah, you're right.
They can do very complicated things without explicit representations of what's going on. But to me, those are just behaviors in the same way that, my thermostat can regulate some things in my house.
Yeah.
They're maybe complicated, but they're not conscious because they aren't explicit, and the paramecium doesn't have a re-representation of its own memory.
Wow.
And there's no meta representation
Oh,
going on.
that's good. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. The idea of being able to meta representation, that does seem to me, now that you say that, now I'm thinking about it, that seems like almost a requirement of consciousness, just you saying that, because you have to have, that was a good way of saying it, re-representation. If you
Right.
don't, that's intriguing.
Think about what the human brain does. So much of it is that, and we have these maps in our somatosensory cortex of the human body. There's a whole, if you stimulate different regions of the postcentral gyrus, you're going to feel a little tingling sensation in your body. So there's a literal map of the actual body
Wow.
up in the brain, and it's those maps of ourselves, that self-mapping function that makes for an explicit representation that I think is so important for this process.
Yeah, that gives credence to the uniqueness of humans, essentially. Not taking that to outside of science. I'm just saying, I like things that make it seem more like humans have this. I like knowing we have a very unique structure. I think we might be the only ones that can create such a re-representation and metacognitively view ourselves.
Well, those somatosensory maps are there in all primates,
Oh,
and not linguistic maps. They're just, we do have you're right. We do have a special kind of meta representation that comes from our unique use of language, and that really does permeate through all of our consciousness once we have it, because it's such an effective tool for re-representing things. But the brain does have non-linguistic explicit representations
yes.
of the internal states of our body and the things that happen within the body, both in the brainstem and at the cortical level. So some of those functions are old and deep within the brainstem. There's nuclei in the brainstem that can sense things from the viscera of the body. So I don't know if consciousness is specific to humans in that way. I think it's definitely older than us, but I do get your point about meta representation being special in people.
Yeah. I like. I'm not going to go too far, but I liked your video. You talked on some with another interview you had about metacognition and cognitive dissonance. And since the hard problem, I like what you're saying about the meta. That gives me an idea of looking at consciousness, as I think you're right. I would like to understand that better. That re-representation, that's a big idea, because we do re-represent in images, and like you said, the heuristic development of language in tiers of like letters to words to sentences. We kind of think in that structure too when we're assembling predictive models of the world. We're assembling a way, kind of in a similar fashion, where we think in language, but what happened? How are we thinking if we don't learn language or learn to read? And so that's interesting. Language is a big part of our uniqueness and the way consciousness works for us too, I bet. And you talk on that some, and that's quite intriguing. And I wanted to ask you too on neurogenesis and mindfulness, just to switch gears a little bit, but I think it's important. I've looked a lot into, or read a lot about people's potential thoughts on neurogenesis occurring due to mindfulness practice. Well, this was something that I read with psilocybin use coupled with mindfulness meditation was producing in people who had traumatic backgrounds. Their brain had kind of had to re-operate in the world to deal with that pressure and stress that was placed on it, like potential abuse, things like that, that were done to people. Their brain and their amygdala and the way that it works was shrunk or enlarged by the impact of like manipulative cognitive abuse that was placed on them by certain other individuals in their lives. And as that happened, it had modified the way their brain operated as far as how the size of the amygdala. And then they had observed some people with those brain symptoms after the fact, after mindfulness and psychedelics in some cases, and they had shown the amygdala had changed a little bit in size. Emotional responses had been a little different. This is self-reporting, so of course we're going on. Bias is probably all over the place, but I find it intriguing kind of that it seems like mindfulness, maybe if people have had some hard times and they've had some traumatic experiences where they have started to view the world in a different light because their cognition had to alter to be around manipulation or whatever, it's a sensitive topic to me, just because I feel like people can be helped a lot with mindfulness in this way. And I wanted to get your opinion on that. Does that sound a little pseudoscientific, or what do you think on mindfulness and its impact on the brain, and not just for people suffering from abuse, but in general? What's the benefit potential of mindfulness becoming a more Western practice here?
Well, okay, so first of all, yes, the brain is plastic. I mean, that's the first point that you made in there, is that the brain can change in all kinds of ways. It kind of has to be, if you think about it, because given that our minds are changing from moment to moment as we learn stuff, there has to be something physically changing about our brains, because it's our brain that holds all this stuff. And if it was identical physically from before this conversation to after this conversation, then you wouldn't be able to remember this conversation, which you can. So there's definitely changes going on in your brain that can be microscopic, or they can be macroscopic changes, like the kind you can see in the change of something like the size of an amygdala. I almost think that level of analysis is less important for us if we're trying to think about the benefits of mindfulness, because, you know, if it helps, then it is interesting. I mean, I'm always curious about how these things work in the brain, but I think it, you know, wouldn't need to change the size of your amygdala to help you with trauma, right? The issue of specifically trauma and mindfulness is kind of a tricky one. I've thought about that a little bit, and I don't know the research on this all that well.
Yeah.
But I think there is you have to be careful, because while I do think in general mindfulness practice is beneficial, and being aware of what's happening in your mind at any given moment is almost always helpful, there might be some circumstances where it isn't. Trauma might be one of those. It's possible that, if you've just been through, I don't know, a war, that, sitting and meditating on what you're experiencing at the moment and really feeling it to its deepest extent may not be the best thing.
Yeah.
In that situation.
Yeah.
I think it's something we have to apply situationally and carefully and mindfully, I guess. But yeah, in general, I think it seems to be a beneficial practice in terms of being able to know what's going on in your own mind. But also, for me, I think one of the great benefits, one of the things that I think is the most important thing to learn with any kind of meditative practice, is not how to be in a meditative state per se, but how to manipulate your own mental state to be in whichever state happens to be most useful to you at the moment. Because the meditative states are useful for because of top-down processing. When we're in a goal-directed state and we have a task in front of us and we're trying to do something, our brain is very efficient at filtering out everything that's unrelated to that task. I come into the room for a pencil. Everything else that's not a pencil is of no interest to my brain at all. And there could be, a gorilla sitting on the couch and I wouldn't notice it if he's not holding my pencil. So that task-oriented mindset is really good for accomplishing things, but not great for taking in new information that isn't related to what we're doing. And so it's really important for us to be able to experience the present moment free of our sort of goal-directed thought, and to be able to take in this other mindset. But it's good for some things and it's not good for other things. So it's really great for us to be able to manipulate our mindset, to be able to be in that meditative state when it's useful, and to be able to be in a task-oriented state when we got something to accomplish.
Excellent point. Yeah, that's critical. And I going back to what you said at the beginning, I agree with you and with Sam Harris. You guys had a conversation on this particular topic, and now it's kind of recurring now. But you guys had talked to each other about, your point on trauma is helpful for people, because people may go to meditation when they get back from war, and that could be bad. But like you said, that's not the point potentially. And I agree that I remember Sam Harris had mentioned, he's like, even if all of that wasn't true, even if the amygdala didn't shrink, even if the blood pressure was even increased or something, it wouldn't matter, because the insights and the look into the nature of the mind and consciousness is the real, almost beneficial part. Because once you can do that, that's when you can start reframing negative emotions. And like the Stoic kind of way of meditating is to look at a negative emotions intently, reframe those negative emotions with the silver lining of them. And that is what's been the most absolutely critically amazing part of mindfulness to me, is if you really want to use it more than 5 minutes a day and not for a big stress ball, as Mr. Harris calls it, if you want to use it for the way you're talking about, which is where the crux of it lies, that is where the benefits are reaped. And it requires more than just a meditation. It requires looking into this and probing the insights that come with it, because then you can really figure out, okay, here's the mechanistic way, here's the practice of meditation, couple those together, and then you can further your meditative practice using understanding the science of it and also the philosophy of it. Helped me a lot, really strengthened my meditation practice, because I could understand it better. And my brain has to work theory and practice so significantly that if I don't have one of those two, then I can't get anything down. If playing golf or playing the guitar, I have to know if I'm going to play guitar, I have to know what the C note is. What is a C note? Why is it called a C? What's an octave? Most people can pick a guitar up and they just start learn chords, but I can't learn guitar. I'm no good at it. And it's like, I'd have to start way back there and then go into the practice of it and put those together. And so I really love what you said about, I think that it's important statement to make, that it's really about being able to structure the way that you interpret the world in any situation. That way you can meditate amidst chaos and understand that you can implement these practices in your day-to-day when you're at work, if somebody makes you upset, or maybe somebody says something wrong to you. It's so important to know that you don't always have to react to that. You can watch yourself react as if you would do it and say, okay, all right, settle down. Okay, why would I ever do that? Why would I get mad? What's that going to do? I'm going to ruminate on being mad and keep myself mad afterwards. And so I think that's brilliant to say. I think that's a good point.
Yeah, so many of our thoughts and behaviors are just automatic reactions to things that we don't really have a voluntary say in, and we just kind of let happen. You asked earlier whether this is, it's possible, or whether I think this could be integrated into a sort of Western culture. I mean, I think in many ways it already has been. The process that you just described of kind of being aware of your thoughts and seeing how one thing leads to another. And then reinterpreting the things that happen. This has been a part of cognitive behavioral therapy for a long time. And so there are elements of this that our cultures from around the world have converged on. The idea that self-examination and understanding, watching your own thoughts and feeling the things that you're feeling and trying to reframe, or at least having the opportunity to reframe what it is that you're experiencing, is a part of psychotherapy, and is also something that one learns from meditation.
Yeah, and that makes sense too. And it's almost like me asking you if it's westernized. Well, it's kind of globalized, because you look at ancient Greece and these thinkers, and you talk a lot, what your work is. My favorite part of your work and discussions that I really enjoy is because I ran into an impasse when I was trying to figure out about emotions and how meditation, one of the insights was that I was trying to figure out was, how do I get from thought to action, and what's mediating that? Because if I'm identifying with every passing thought in the moment, does a thought go from, okay, identify with that one, turn it into emotion, and then act? So I was thinking in my head, I'm looking at thoughts. I'm trying to be nicer to people. I'm trying to, even amidst somebody being terrible, or not terrible, but maybe not making me happy, I still can be happy. And the way I was trying to figure out how to do that metacognitively was saying, I'm identifying with too many thoughts, and then I'm acting on them. And in between that, I'm feeling something that's causing me to complete the thought into an action. And I really wanted to interrupt that, because I was having terrible anxiety issues, and I didn't want to take medication for it anymore, just my own belief. I wanted to try to figure out this myself. And I looked into your work, and I was like, oh, wow, this is awesome that somebody is doing this work and that they're so interested in it. And so I wanted to ask you just about the emotion versus what a definition of emotion is basically, but also what your models of emotion are in your idea. Is it like these primitive emotions, and then there's some advanced emotions, or is it more of a fluidity of emotional response, and kind of how you look at emotion versus thought and feeling?
Yeah, great. I mean, there's very little agreement in the scientific world on what actually constitutes an emotion, what the definition of an emotion is. And so what we do is, just before we write about it, we just try to set out what we mean by it. And it isn't necessarily what everyone else means, and it's certainly not what it means colloquially. But what we really mean when we talk about emotion in our lab are the sort of actual motion. It's the root of the word is motion, and it comes from the actual actions that the body does in response to some kind of salient stimulus in the environment, something that threatens our homeostasis or is beneficial to our homeostasis. Yeah. These are very early biological systems for dealing with the regulation of life. So for example, if there's a shark in the water, my body's going to go through a series of action patterns to respond to that threat. My heart rate's going to increase, my pupils might dilate. All these things are going to happen. And then, because we do have these re-representations, because we have these explicit representations of what's happening in our body, we're also going to generate conscious feelings. So for us, feelings are the conscious correlates of emotions. They're our conscious awareness of what's happening in our body. And you're about to get on stage and you feel the butterflies in your stomach. It's a feeling that you have. And from there, there's a whole kind of interpretive process, and there's a whole lot of feedback loops that happen as we interpret what those feelings mean in the context that we are presented with. Yeah. So am I excited to get on stage? Am I nervous about getting on stage? All these things are potential interpretations that lead to other interpretations. And so it becomes very complicated from there. So these things are rooted in things that happen in the body, and they're rooted in our old biological systems for keeping us alive, but then they are elaborated by all of the complex cognitive machinery that we have. And the interesting thing about emotions that relates to something you said is that they're so tightly integrated into almost everything that we do. Sometimes we think of ourselves as conscious computers that sit around thinking in a very abstract meta sort of way, and that's true, but almost every thought is accompanied by some kind of a feeling. And the integration between feeling and thought is just they're so intricately linked that you really can't pull them apart. Even if you're thinking about a philosophical problem, and I'm thinking about, okay, is panpsychism true? Well, I can bring up all the arguments, then there's usually some feeling about whether they're correct or not that I follow, and then maybe I have a feeling of doubt about that, and then a feeling about certainty about this, which leads to another thought. And there's this interplay between cognition and feeling that we really can't extricate feeling from thought.
It's hard.
It's hard, and there's a perception sometimes in cognitive science that emotion is a barrier to good thought, or that it's something that works against us having clear thoughts. This is something that shows up in science fiction a lot. I'm a big Star Trek fan, and I always love the emotionless character that's been in every iteration of Star Trek, like Commander Data or Mr. Spock back in the day. The Vulcans who were so good at suppressing their emotions that they could think entirely logically. Yeah. But we know from actual cases of brain damage that when people have damage to the parts of their brains that help to incorporate emotions into thought, they don't become Mr. Spock, who's hyperlogical. They actually make very poor decisions. When you can't think about how the consequence of your emotion is going to make you feel, you end up making really bad decisions. And people with this kind of brain damage, they tend to have very messy lives that don't actually work that well.
Absolutely.
So emotion can be a very helpful part of it. Isn't necessarily a working against good thought. It's something that we just need to incorporate well into our thoughts.
Good point. Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, right there at the tail end of that, it's something really neat, because I had recently, or I just purchased this book, but I'm in the process of trying to get through it, and I can't remember who wrote it, and I hate that I can't, because I'll put it in the description of this video just because I don't want to say something that I want to credit this person. And it's called Emotion, but he speaks on this fluidity of emotional models that aren't so structured on tiers, where you've got anger, jealousy, lust, things like that. And then it builds to more advanced cognitive states of emotion. He's kind of promoting, or not promoting, but presenting this ideology that maybe emotions are fluid, and there's thousands of emotions, that are just a little bit different than the other one, and they make you do different things. And so it was like, without emotion, like me, just like something simple as me making this my trying to pursue this YouTube channel. I've never tried this before, but without emotion, I never would have done that, because logically it makes really no sense for me to spend my extra time talking about something, and I don't have and so it's like, I feel happy when I do that, or something like, just like yourself or whomever, if you like to ride your bike, you feel happy and energetic to go do that. Otherwise, you'd be like, well, logically I could go make more money, or logically I could go and build something that I need to do, or, emotion seems to add that extra degree of, let's go do this because it's worthwhile doing. And so I think that's neat. And I know that I reference Sam Harris a lot, because I like he applies to a lot of this, and you guys talk a lot together, and it's cool. But he talks about anxiety being a representation of, like, excited to get on a roller coaster is almost the same type of feeling as you get when you're negatively anxious. And it's almost a reframing. You can reframe the actual emotion in your head. So you can couple the logic with your emotion and reframe it like, oh, I'm paying money to get on this roller coaster to feel the same emotion I'm going to feel when I'm anxious to go to a job interview and I'm scared to walk in the room, but it's reframed in its environment, kind of.
That's right. Yeah, that's that interpretation step where the same sort of feelings from the body could be interpreted in different ways. I like what you said about the value of emotion there in helping you to decide what to do, because there is a real intelligence in our emotional systems. They are one of life's original forms of intelligence, and there can be a wisdom to listening to them. I mean, to me, one of the most important emotions for me is curiosity. The feeling of I want to know about that.
Yeah.
It's not really a cognitive thing. It really is a feeling, and following that feeling, I think, is very, very important, because there is an intelligence to that. There's some reason why my brain wants to figure that out that I might not be aware of. Where it gets tricky is like when you don't really know which emotions should I be listening to and which ones are actually there because of some habit that I have, or aren't serving me well. So if you go the other way and you just constantly follow your emotions, you have a mess as well.
Yeah.
So
You got to have that logic develop first to couple with that emotion, because we've seen the damage that emotional only responses can do to people's lives. Like you had just said, if you lesion an emotion out of the brain somehow or another through damage, not mitigated on accident, most like certainly, but you see poor decisions. And if you just act strictly on emotion and not logic, so you have to, it's almost like a maturation of your wisdom, that's which is such an abstract word to define, but the ancient Greeks, that's all they were trying to find in their dialogues, and Plato's dialogue in the Symposium and things like that. It's people, these guys they may not have been armed with the scientific ability to perform the excellent work that we're doing now and you're doing, which is so great, but they still got to this core of like, where does empathy come from? Why do we feel this? Is this the ultimate emotion? Love? Is that what binds it all together? So they may not have been able to dispense with the same concreteness that we can today. But these inquiries have been a human's crux of the philosophical questions for a long time. And it's such a neat thing to see, to be able to have the internet and see your work and see people going and doing what the ancient Greeks wanted to find out, but doing it with our ability now. It makes me happy to know that there's people doing this. And I think that only good things can come from people looking into work that people like you are doing, because they can use this to help further their mindfulness practice, to help understand how to act better, and maybe how to nurture empathy, how to maybe make a little bit more of it, how to find it, how to get it, because it's important to balance empathy with other emotions, because empathy can be a little bit damaging to you if you overuse it or overexpress it, but it's also really damaging if it goes away completely. In fact, it's intriguingly important to me that somehow something happens in the world where we figure out when somebody cannot express empathy at all, just an absence of it. That's some of the scariest human beings to me, and not in a bad way. I'm just saying, you've seen the non-expression of empathy. What is your opinion on that? I mean, I guess that would be sociopathy almost, but what is it's sensitive to me to see that, because it seems like those kinds of people do wreak havoc global, like Hitler or something like that on an extreme scale. But I don't want to pick people out or anything like that. That's not what I mean. I'm interested in the lack of empathy and your opinion on empathy briefly. I know it's a big topic, but
yeah, it's a big topic. I mean, one way in that what you were just describing makes me think of is we've written a paper recently. This is my postdoc, Leonardo Christoph Moore, is the first author in this, and the title of the paper is Our Robots Sociopaths. And the idea is that there's a lot of work in artificial intelligence on the topic of empathy, and most artificial intelligences that are developing some form of empathy are really learning how to respond to human expressions of emotion. So you have systems that can detect emotion really well, and to respond to it in order to present someone what seems like a warmer response. If you're interacting with some kind of artificial intelligence, and it knows how you're feeling a little bit and can match its tone to the way you're behaving, that can make it seem more personable. That's one of the goals of empathic artificial intelligences. But they tend to be systems that can detect and understand the mental states and the emotional states of others, and then respond to them. But most of those artificial systems don't actually feel anything themselves, because we haven't developed feeling robots yet, right?
The philosophical zombies.
they're sociopaths, because this is basically what we call someone who's able to do that, to understand and manipulate our emotions really well, but doesn't really feel them themselves. So there's a real danger right now, I think, that we're building these systems that are potentially really, really good at understanding and manipulating our mental states and emotions, but don't have real versions of them themselves, that we're creating set of sociopaths. And the interesting thing there is that there might be a way to build feeling robots if we understand what we were talking about earlier, the functions that are involved in homeostatic processes that give rise to feeling. If we build robots that have real vulnerabilities, that have actual something like a body that they have to worry about and take care of, that they can have the rudimentary bases for homeostatic like feelings, and build from there, that we could eventually build robots that could really understand what it's like to be in pain because they felt it themselves, and then we'd have real empathy in a robot instead of just recognizing that when I'm wincing, it should hand me a Band-Aid.
Absolutely, and it might. That's a good point. I've thought about AI a few times, but it's so out of my element on it that it's interesting to see how it does come onto the scene a lot in these type of discussions and in these type of work. And it's interesting because that's kind of what David Chalmers, the guy who kind of created the hard problem. A lot of times when people ask about how do you represent the hard problem to people who don't have an interest in it or have never thought about subjectivity and the uniqueness of subjectivity. And I believe there was a professor at Ned Block at NYU who did a poll on this with his students and asked, well, he basically determined that like 75% of his students didn't care or grasp the idea of the hard problem or subjectivity at all. And so it's intriguing to me in that regard, because the hard problem is not a hard problem if people don't understand it. And so you're only going to have 25% of people who even specialize in psychology who want to pursue it. And then probably 2% of those that actually go and do it academically. Because you're looking at just mathematically, I don't think you're going to have a large, which is fine because it arises everywhere sort of. But he used the idea of a philosophical zombie to further the hard problem by saying you could have a robot act in accordance with what seems conscious and you would never know that it wasn't. And so that's why that's what kind of like, why wouldn't all humans be these philosophical zombies, as he calls them? Why wouldn't they just be stimuli? Light comes into the eye, it's red, I act in accordance with red and everything. Why do some people act differently? And so that's like a robot kind of.
It's an interesting thought experiment. I think part of the answer there is that we arose through different processes, right? That our brains came from the process of evolution where we did have this issue of life, where we had a physical body to keep alive.
Oh, good idea.
Artificial intelligences generally aren't starting as embodied creatures that evolve with the primary purpose of keeping some physical, as you said, anti-entropy from happening.
Yeah.
They're just things that we program to solve specific goals. And so that's why I think if you do want a robot that isn't a zombie, that you have to put it through some kind of a similar process that we went through in
Okay, cool.
The evolution of life.
Yeah. And when I was talking with Dr. Cook about the anti-entropic aspects that I was thinking of, and he was writing about, we talked about how it could possibly be this idea that we're actually anti-entropic, that it's actually a facade, that it's just more, actually we're becoming, as we evolve, more disordered. And it's just an illusion, consciousness, it's like conversations turn into kind of oddballs sometimes like that. But we were reframing, like, what if it's an illusion or a facade that we're actually becoming more complex? And it's just a different presentation of complexity evolving to more disorganization. But I think I'm just bringing that up anecdotally. I believe that that's something really critical to nucleic acids and the origin of RNA. I really truly think that three-dimensional shapes arose whenever you have a double-stranded DNA molecule, and you have depth, and you have that all, and you have that double helix. And Francis Crick, who was absolutely critical to this discovery of the double helix, I believe, he was a consciousness speaker. And so I haven't looked into his talks on that. I just found out about this a few days ago, and I was like, whoa, how is that possible? Francis Crick. And I was thinking DNA and nucleic acids might have something to do with it, because they are the instruction manual for developing every protein that does every function in every body. And so once you have this instruction manual that tells a cell how to generate a human being, you're looking at thousands of miles of DNA in your body, and it's just turning on and off of these genes that tells you to grow an arm and not turn into a toad. And so it really is. I mean, once you have a nucleus in a eukaryotic cell, so you have a membrane that separates itself and your DNA is out in the cytoplasm, and then you have a membrane around the DNA, you're separating more. You're having tiers of separation from your environment. The nucleus separated from the cytoplasm from the environment. And as you do that, you're getting tiers of complexity, and then you're getting more advanced instruction manuals for life. And so I think the idea, just like with language, the heuristics of language, going from letter to word to paragraph, going from DNA, RNA to DNA to a cell membrane to a nucleus, and you see complexity associated with those. I think somewhere in there, there's some kind of wild philosophical maybe connection between that and consciousness.
I definitely think that life has gotten more complex. And, if you look at the human brain, you measure the complexity of it with the sort of mathematical quantifications of complexity, and you look at the amount of and number of interconnections. I don't think there's anything as complex in the known universe as the human brain.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. I'm not some degree of complexity. I think is required for consciousness, and that's why I'm not a panpsychist, I guess, because I think some system like an electron or an atom is not quite complex enough, or doesn't have the right functional arrangements to yield consciousness.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. No, and I'm actually, yeah, I'm gonna certainly, I've been revising my take on all of this, but I go back to what you said earlier. The meta ability is just too complex to say that consciousness can just exist just by the sake of, like, panpsychism saying at the most fundamental level. No way, not really, probably all the way, because there's just something about the meta view of the mind. And like you said, I agree with you on that. There's got to be something to that. And so I think, yeah, panpsychism is an interesting thing to probe, but I've been slowly finding certain things that make me want to revise the whole fundamental force of consciousness as like the same thing as a strong nuclear force. It's just there from the universe. That is a little bit odd.
Right. Well, hey, that's admirable for you to remain open. As we know, it's difficult for one to change one's mind if you get too attached. So good not to be too attached to any of these ideas, right?
Yeah, and I try to follow your idea of being trying to subdue the self enough to be open to rapid belief change, so that you don't chase a rabbit that doesn't exist for the sake of having chased it for 20 years already. I don't want to fall into that, and so I appreciate that. And I know it's almost about an hour. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I hope that do you have anything else you would like to say on any of this or anything like that by chance? I don't want to interrupt you or anything. I'm not in any rush. I just don't want to take your time too much.
No, I mean, I could talk about this stuff forever. I mean, this
Yeah.
is an interesting topic in the world, which is why I've spent my life thinking about it for the better part of the last few decades. So, yeah, I mean, if there's anything else, any other burning questions that we didn't get to, definitely throw it out there.
Okay, yeah, just that would be great. I would like to get your opinion on cognitive dissonance. And also free will. Just two more topics I wanted to ask you about. Free will. I know free will can evolve. I wanted to just, since I don't get a chance to talk with people who have, with somebody like yourself, and I really appreciate your time and means a lot to me. And the cognitive dissonance means a lot to me, and in my own beliefs myself, because I worry a lot, or not worry, but I think sometimes I'm like, why do I act in a way that is not in accordance with leading to a better future? Why do I act in ways that are present gratification, knowing that it's going to lead to regret? Why would I act in a way, I was thinking, is that the nature of wisdom, knowing and having the ability to listen to your own advice about something, and how cognitive dissonance is like it could be like a terror that can wreak havoc on you, because you're constantly acting in the antithesis of how you should. I wonder if eventually, if you do that long enough, if you just become subdued to the effect of cognitive dissonance. Seems to me you need to feel it, you need to nurture it, you need to listen to it, because you don't need to be feeling it all the time. You want to act in a way where you're not in this dissonant state all the time. And so I wanted to ask your opinion on cognitive dissonance and its impact on our cognition.
That's a really interesting setup for it. I mean, in one sense, I don't think you can completely avoid feelings of cognitive dissonance. So just to give a little definition to cognitive dissonance, is the feeling that's associated with the conflict between something you experience in the world and some attitude or belief that you have. So it could be, as you mentioned, a difference between what you intend for yourself. I want to lose weight, but I find myself eating a hamburger, and I think hamburgers aren't good for me. And so there's a dissonance there. And then it's a bad feeling that we like to avoid, and so we avoid it in a number of ways. You can avoid it by not eating the hamburger, or you can avoid it by changing your beliefs to be in accord with what you find yourself doing. So I can say, oh, well, actually hamburgers aren't that bad for me. They got protein, right?
Yep.
Or I could change what I'm actually doing. So there's a lot of different ways to get out of it. I mean, from some perspective, it just arises from the fact that we have a lot of different intentions, and the brain is so complex that we're not always going to be have a single-minded intention. We have a lot of competing things going on, a lot of competing goals. For example, you have long-term goals, you have short-term goals, and the problem of life is in managing and reconciling all those goals. And in some cases, there's always going to be some conflicts that come up among them.
Yeah.
I really don't want to gain weight, but I'm really hungry right now. So those are things that you're going to have to resolve to some degree. The kinds of cognitive dissonance that I've been most interested in are the ones that have to do with information and knowledge, and what it feels like when we encounter knowledge or arguments that is conflicting with what we hold to be true about the world, and how we resolve those kinds of conflicts. I believe that the earth is flat, but I see a ship disappearing over the horizon. What am I going to do now? I've got these two different things that are in conflict with each other. Am I going to change my belief and update it, or am I going to find some rationalization that allows me to keep my belief and not have to deal with this evidence? And to me, this is a really pressing problem because of the information sphere that we find ourselves in right now, and that we're dealing with so much information deluge on a constant basis, and that many of the algorithms that present information to us are designed to give us information that agrees with our beliefs, that it can become really easy to do the primary strategy for avoiding this conflict is to just make sure that you don't encounter any information that challenges your beliefs. And we're very good at this. We can put ourselves in a position where we never have to come across anything that challenges us. This is how information bubbles form. And it's easy to associate with people who agree with you and have the same beliefs as you, and to never encounter somebody who does disagree with you the way that social media is set up right now. So that makes avoiding this kind of dissonance really, really easy.
Yeah.
But when we do encounter information that conflicts with our beliefs, then we have all kinds of other strategies for dealing with it. We can rationalize, we can put down the source of the information, we can bring up all the counter arguments we have. There's a lot of different things that happen.
Intriguing. Yeah. Wow. I never thought about it like that. Kind of, these are strategy. That's a very cool way of looking at how people just don't want to change their beliefs, and how they can just manifest all of these oddball ways of just protecting the ego's stoic chain that binds it to this like archaic structure they've had for so long. It's like, would you rather just change it? I mean, I'm getting a little bit nonsensically angry. It's just kind of like, I understand that these tools are employed by these people, by everyone. And I've been working on trying to get rid of them, because not all the way. I still want my defenses there to be intelligent, but you also have to have a certain baseline intelligence and continue to develop that intelligence in order to know and discern between when to change your beliefs. And that way you're not whimsically operating like, oh, I'll buy that today, I'll believe in that today, and then tomorrow. You got to intelligently use wisdom to when to change them. But you can only do that if you educate and listen to everything, and then discern, not censor, but listen everything and discern properly. But if you're so opposed to listening to anything that if your ego or your voice inside your head, the little man kicks in and starts saying, no, listen to me, and stop listening to that person talking, they're wrong. And then you just retract into yourself during a conversation. And then you're inside your ego the whole time, already telling yourself to hate this, or not hate this person, but don't listen to any of this. And so you just mute button on your mind. And then after that, you go back and you talk to your friends about it, or whoever you're talking to, and you tell them, and they also agree with you. So then you further discredit the information you just heard. So then you just build up these walls that are just fortified and fortified and fortified.
Yes. But to have empathy for those of us who do that, I mean, we all do it.
I do it. Yeah. That's why I'm saying I'm nonsensically being angry about it, because I do this.
Right. The other aspect of it that gives me more empathy for why we do this is just to think about what the root some of the root causes are, and behind any kind of behavior like this, there's always a motivation hiding, because again, we aren't these sort of pure logical information processing machines. We have our reasons and motivations that come from our whole organism. And embedded in what you said there are some of the motivations for why we don't want to deal with this kind of information, is that it isn't just a matter of changing a belief. A lot of times, in order to change your mind about many of these things, you're also going to have to change many other aspects of your life, your behavior, and your identity, and your social life. Social life, social connections are one of the main mechanisms that hold beliefs in place. You have a set of friends that think of you a certain way, and you all share a certain set of beliefs. I mean, my friends are all flat earthers, and that's who I spend my time with. the fact that I went out and saw this ship on the horizon and now I changed my mind. Now, how am I going to go back to these people and explain that? I mean, they're not going to invite me to dinner tomorrow night. And, I'm going to have to change more than just some fact that's in my head about the world. I'm going to have to change my actual life. And so, there can be strong motivations for not changing. In the case of the flat Earth, maybe that sounds trivial, but because of religious belief, for example, and you have your whole extended family that's not going to talk to you anymore if you change this one belief. I mean, there can be a lot at stake for a lot of these things.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Yeah, and I understand. I understand. Yeah, I have an empathy that's associated with that, and understand why it's hard for people to do it, and so that's why I catch myself even there, like the frustration. It doesn't need to come out. It's more or less just myself. I'm maybe frustrated with myself because it took me so long to be able to do it for myself, and like you said, all of those things you have to do. I kind of did those things. And I did them because I believe in what I'm doing, or believe in what I'm trying to figure out, or believe in what I'm coming to believe. And I believe in its merit. And so I was able to accept all of those consequences kind of and go forward anyways. And that's not something that gives me any ability beyond anybody else. In fact, it could be people don't have to change their beliefs, and people might be comfortable operating just as they are, and who knows, they could be right and I'm wrong the whole time anyways. And so it's not like you're any elevated above anybody because you can change your beliefs quicker, but it's a skill, and in order to discern and to get wisdom, you do have to be able to do it. But it is a process that is not everybody wants to do, and it's not necessarily elevated above a stoic form of belief because you truly believe something either, but it's intriguing. And it's intriguing research that you do on belief change. And it speaks to the idea of the ego and the self, because the self is at the core of that. It's what's telling you to stick with those beliefs, I think. It's what's telling you have free will. It's kind of, I know we talked about Annika Harris earlier, and I just bring her up because she's such a good thinker, and she's very accessible in her writings. And she spoke on recently in her article on panpsychism on the Consciousness Journal, and I really like her thoughts on stuff. And she said something along the lines of free will being an illusion could be an illusion in itself because it's part of the self that's an illusion, kind of like where it's a product of the self, which is also a product of the mind creating the self, if that makes any sense. And so I think maybe some of this belief change ties back into the concept of free will a little bit, because you have to have will to change your beliefs. I think of free will as maybe an illusion sometimes. And I in certain kind of philosophical circles, and I was trying to figure out what your thoughts on that, how the self and free will tie back to this last topic of belief change I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I definitely have sympathy for the idea that free will is an illusion. It certainly is, in the sense that nothing that we do or nothing that the brain does is uncaused by something earlier. I mean, it's sort of part of the causal chain of reality, and doesn't leave that chain, whether that chain is fully deterministic or some kind of probabilistic quantum thing doesn't really matter. I mean, everything that we do is caused by something prior or directly dependent on it. And so, yes, in that sort of like hard philosophical sense, that free will doesn't make much sense, doesn't seem to be a coherent concept to me. On the other hand, in terms of describing our psychology and our neurology, there certainly is an important distinction between things that we do that are voluntary and things that are involuntary, right? So like a seizure that happens in my arm is rightfully called involuntary, whereas when I decide to move my arm and pick up my phone that's right here, that's a voluntary action, because it involves a whole bunch of different functional mechanisms that the seizure doesn't involve. It involves planning and prediction, and it's in accordance with the goals that my other parts of my brain had at a particular time. And so I think it is useful to distinguish voluntary from involuntary actions, and to think about what the immediate causes of our actions are, knowing that the ultimate causes are never within us.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good point. And that's kind of, because I don't dispense too well, or don't seem to get along too well with the idea of free will being non-existent, a complete and utter facade. Like some do, like the hard philosophers, like you said, Daniel Dennett, I think you mentioned earlier, and people like that. Do you think there's a difference between free will potentially and conscious will? Like maybe free will is your organism's response to an environmental stimuli that you would react to survive, and so you do it prior to higher level cognition. So like if there's like a loud noise and you jump away from it, when you jump away from that loud noise, whenever that occurs, you don't really think about the fact that you jumped away from it until after you jumped, and so it's kind of like you're responding to something that could possibly help you survive in that section, in that very second. But then if you hear a loud noise and it's not thundering outside, and it's thundering outside or something, you can cognitively know that's not a threat, and you can stay still in your place. So it's like a higher level cognition occurs where you can override those biological responses. And that's kind of like free will is like maybe not so much, it's somewhat of an illusion in the fact that, yeah, if your organism wants to survive, it's probably going to force you to get out of a bad situation, and you can't control that part of it. But conscious will is what makes us human, almost, where we can cognate at a high level and decide if that stimuli is worth running away from or not.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at. I think I would probably separate the issue of whether an action is voluntary or involuntary from the issue of whether we experience it as voluntary, because those two seem to involve different mechanisms. So on the one hand, this continuum of something that's involuntary, like a reflex, to something that is clearly voluntary because it's got this sort of complex planning mechanism involved, where we might consider all the options by imagining a future, contrafactual futures where we choose different things. And then based on those imaginations, we select an appropriate action. That's what we would call a voluntary action, as opposed to something that's like, just reflexive. Or in Daniel Dennett's book on free will, he calls it speciousness, or specs, based on
Oh, okay.
right?
I haven't read his book yet. I need to read that. I'm going to try to read some of his book.
Called Elbow Room.
Okay, cool.
Varieties of free will worth wanting.
Awesome.
And that continuum there has to do with what cognitive mechanisms go into selecting the action, and the more and more complicated things that we can do to select actions that put them more under our direct control, or at least put them in terms of in alignment with what we think our goals are. But then there's this issue of when it feels like we're doing something ourselves, and that is like, it seems to me like an overlay process that the brain has that doesn't always correspond to whether something's really voluntary or not. It's an inference that the brain makes, and it's an inference that appears to have a lot to do with the predictions that we make about our own behavior. So if something is predicted, if we sort of know what's going to happen, if we know what our arm is going to do right before we do it, then we feel like we're doing it. So when I reach for the phone, part of what's happening is my brain is making predictions about the sensory consequences of that action before they even come in, and then it's going to make a comparison. And because I have that predictive process, I know what's going to happen, and there are no surprises. Whereas if you move my arm, I don't know exactly where it's going to go, and I don't know exactly how it's going to feel, and the movements are therefore unpredicted and surprising, and it doesn't feel as much like I'm doing it. So there's that feeling of agency that seems to come from a predictive process that I think is a sort of separate, independent issue. And it's part of why I agree that free will is an illusion, because that feeling we have of free will is just an inference. It doesn't necessarily correspond to whether or not something really is voluntary or involuntary.
Fascinating. I like that. That's really cool. Coupling of the prediction model kind of that you talk about, you and Sam talked about. And I like that. One of y'all's more recent talks that you guys had was cool. And so you're kind of coupling free will with that. That's really cool. I think that's a neat way to look at free will. Wow.
Yeah, and I think it helps to explain why certain things that the brain does that are coming from itself don't feel like it's coming from itself. So like, Sam and I talked about auditory hallucinations as an example of this, and where your brain is creating vocalizations or subvocalizations that sound like voices from the outside world. If you look at brain activity, you can see that the auditory cortex is doing things as if we're hearing voices, but they're generated by the brain itself. And it's possible that, if some predictive mechanism goes wrong such that you don't know those thoughts are coming just before they come, that they feel like they're thoughts coming from the outside. So you can kind of, this is a fallible mechanism, this agency inference that we make. And there are cases where it breaks down, where there are sort of illusions of control that happen.
Yeah, that's an interesting take on auditory hallucinations too. I think I heard that, I remember hearing something along those lines from you guys. I didn't think about it too much, but yeah, that's interesting to apply that to auditory hallucinations. It's kind of intriguing, fascinating. Well, cool. All right. Well, I really and thoroughly, I'm gonna since it's been about an hour or so, I'm gonna let you go. And I wanted to say one more time that I think the work that you're doing, there's a lot more I have to read and a lot more I have to learn from you, but I I look forward every time to y'all releasing more on the brain and mind. And without having listened to a lot of that and really having you and Sam to listen to, a lot of these inquiries would have been left dead in the water for me without the research you guys do. And I promoted you guys to my friends and family, trying to say, hey, look, check out this guy's research. And it's really cool. And it really means a whole lot to me to come on here and have to be able to talk directly with you. Because it's very, as I was listening to you for the last several months, never would I thought that I'd be able to, hey, to ask Jonas a question. And so it means a lot. It's really cool to me to have that. And I so much appreciate you coming and talking with me.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm really glad that that you're enjoying it and it's doing something for you. And I think it's also really important what you're doing. It's great to have the younger generation keep these questions alive. You guys are going to be you're going to have to think about these things when we're gone. So keep up the good work.
Awesome. No, absolutely. And hopefully I'll talk to you in the future sometime. And you take care. And once again, thanks so much.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, Ethan.
Yep. Thank you.